If you're having a hard time dating, just know that it's not just you. Dating is hard, and it's not your fault. Well, it might be your fault, but it's more complicated than that, which is why this video is important. Dating is hard, but dating has always been hard. It's just been hard for different reasons. To understand the current state of dating, we need to look back at how things have changed over the years. Let's start off in the pre-modern era, caveman times. Now, there wasn't a whole lot of dating going on back then because there weren't that many people. What was really happening back then should be described more like there's a lot of banging. People were banging, and it wasn't particularly friendly. Now, this seems gruesome, but you gotta think, if they didn't do it, none of us would be here right now. Fast forward about 100,000 years, now we're in early human civilization. Now, dating back then was mostly about going to the next village and trying to find someone who wasn't your cousin. And this was tough because most people back then were cousins. So you try your best to find someone who's not your cousin, but if she actually is your cousin, no one's going to judge you. People were pretty laid back at the time about that sort of thing. The hard part about dating in this era was that you really had to know how to farm and raise crops. So if you went on a date with a girl and she found out you didn't know how to irrigate a field, you looked pretty dumb. Now, the Middle Ages, this was medieval times, the times of knights and chivalry. This was when courtship, as we know it, truly began. Courtship meant that you went after the girl and you had to prove yourself. Proving yourself to women back then was mostly about fighting another guy. You and this other guy both want this girl, and the only way to settle things was a duel. So you and him went out into a field and put on your armor, and you just fought. This was tough because sometimes in the middle of a fight, you really do have a moment of clarity, and you think, I don't even really like this girl, but I still have to finish this fight. Once the fight was over, you could actually take this girl out on a date. Maybe you go out to the theater, but most of the time you were just sort of walking around in the forest. Maybe you see a public execution or something. The big topic of discussion on a first date back then was, hey, you don't have the plague, right? If you did, it'd be cool, but I do want to know. The 17th century was known as the Romance era. This was when arranged marriages started to go away and people really married for love. This was also when women started reading books. So romance novels started giving them an idea of what to actually expect from love and from dating. This was tough because who can compete with that, right? This girl wants to ride a horse or something, and you don't got a horse. Now, the late 17th and 18th century were known as the exploration era. This was when men first had to brag about all the places they traveled to. This was tough because sometimes women just aren't impressed by all the spices that you have in your house. Even though you really had to go pretty far to get those spices. Maybe you could give her some silk or something. Women were really impressed by silk back then. Frontier times. Now, this was the cowboy era. Dating in this time period was, in one word, dusty. Everybody was covered in a fine layer of dust. Now, a date in this era would mostly be going out to the saloon and listening to a honky-tonk piano guy play that one song that he knows how to play. And then maybe after that, you go up to the mountains, hunt some rabbits. These were hard times, and women had dirt on their faces all the time. So if you were a guy who had a towel and a bucket of water, she was down to stick around. The 1930s and 1940s were when modern dating, as we know it, really started. Before this era, an acceptable date was really just walking around in a field somewhere and maybe going to a lake and catching a fish. But starting in the 1930s, women really wanted the guy to have a plan. We got to get in a car and we got to go do something. Luckily, this was the era of movies. So you could always just go see a movie, which was convenient because then you don't really have to think about anything to talk about because the movie is happening and we're just watching that. The 1950s was an era of rock and roll and people dancing like Elvis. A lot of men died in the Korean War, so there was a nice ratio going on in the country. People drove big cars and gas was cheap. Now, a big topic of discussion on a first date in the 1950s was, hey, you're not a communist, right? That is starting to become a big deal in the world, and I just gotta know. The 1960s was a lot like the 1950s, except now you need a van. Cool guys back then always had a van, and they were down to drive really far. Lots of history happened in the 1960s, so there was that to talk about. Hey, can you believe that guy got killed? No, not him. I mean his brother. Yep. Damn shame. I like that guy. The 1970s was the era of the gas crisis. All that cheap gas from the 1950s, that stuff's gone. Now gas is expensive and you have to line up for it. This was a tough era to date because women didn't respect bicycles back then. So you pull up to the girl's house on a bike and you just gotta really hope that she wants to see Star Wars, because if not, this is gonna be a real bad date. The 1980s was a decade of success in America. This is when dudes first started making a lot of money on Wall Street and everybody was working out. It was a tough time if you didn't have any money or if your arms were just naturally skinny, because nobody respected that unless you were Prince. And let's face it, you're not Prince. The 1990s was probably the peak of dating. This was when people had the most technology, but without having it on you all the time. Most people didn't have cell phones, and the internet was just at home. It was a great time to drive a Toyota sedan, like a Corolla or a Camry. At some point in the date, she would lean over and say, "Wow, is your car really at 270,000 miles?" And you say, "Yeah, and I just put gas in it and just drive. I do an oil change every 15,000 miles." The 2000s were the beginning of the end. Now, anybody who tells you they were on a date on 9/11 is probably lying, because the attack happened early in the morning, so there's no way you were on a date. You're just saying that to be a big shot. The 2000s was when cell phones came out and ruined everything. Now you're on a date and you're thinking to yourself, I wonder what this girl is looking at on her phone. Probably nothing. But it was something. It's always something. The 2010s and 2020s were when things got even worse. There are men now who yearn to be back in the medieval days when they could prove themselves to a woman just by fighting somebody in a field. And maybe they're right, but most likely these men would have lost that fight. And now what are you going to do? You just got your ass kicked by another guy who is dressed up like a medieval knight. Don't you feel stupid?